Welcome back. So, where we left off, we were talking about the development of globalization and how this has been accelerating in the age of the internet. Um, and we also alluded at the very beginning to the different types of globalization, political, economic, cultural. So this section, we're going to spend some time discussing the types of globalization and their various impacts. Um, we've been talking mostly about economic globalization, money, supply chains, trade, etc. But the other thing we can see with economic globalization that we haven't yet touched on fully is the rise and power of multinational corporations. Um, Multinational corporations are companies that sell goods and services around the world and accumulate globally, right? Or at least in various different nation states. Um, but if we think about their power and the hard power of these corporations specifically, as if we remember that economic power is a form of hard power, some of these multinational corporations are actually more powerful than entire nation states, which completely transforms the landscape of global politics. Companies such as Apple, for example, uh, that are worth trillions of dollars in valuation, have much more power than many small nation states and are able to mobilize more power, influence, resources than many different nation states around the globe. So this of course, transforms the landscape of geopolitics. These powerful multinational corporations and the power and influence they have over nation states uh, changes the dynamics of domestic and international politics. We can see the lobbying power of various corporations, even on the Canadian state, the American state is very obvious, the lobbying power of various multinational corporations. Um, for example, if a state says that if a government of a state says they want to raise the minimum wage, a corporation can move to a country, a multinational corporation can move to a country with a lower minimum wage. And the impact of of a major corporation leaving a state might be an enormous economic cost, especially on a weaker economy, right? Um, and when this happens, the blame is often uh, placed on the state for implementing these policies or that an individual corporation might not desire, such as the rise in the minimum wage, right? Um, so a state that might be trying to do the right thing for its population, you know, limiting the ability for corporations to exploit the labor of their population at a very low cost, for example. Um, even this act that might be uh, done for the benefit of the citizenry might lead to consequences, unintended consequences for the individuals of that state because of this globalized aspect of multinational corporations, right? And the ability for them to move based on on policies which are friendly to their accumulation. Um, we've also talked about the ease in which money can move from one place to another. Um, there was always the ability to wire money, but often by paying a large fee, and it was a much more complex process, right? Um, but now, if you, for instance, you can just do this over your phone through an app, right? And you can send money anywhere. And this changes, even at the micro to macro level, right? So if your friend grabs a check, for instance, and you want to contribute, you can, send the money at a click of a button. You can also send money to very far away at a click of a button. So it changes everything. Um, Many people have investments around the world. People invest in foreign stock markets and profit or lose from these investments happening from the click of a button from a phone or a computer. Um, People can work internationally from their computers, even from their cell phones. For example, if you have a smartphone, there's people who do international trade and commerce from a smartphone. Um, so you can also buy goods from around the world, which also transforms commerce, right? So if you want to, for instance, a cheap watch that looks like one from an expensive department store, or if you want kind of knockoff expensive designer shoes, that you can buy them. And often these items that are, cheap knockoffs, etc., are often made in similar or even maybe the same factory settings in which you buy brand name items. So you can log into AliExpress and purchase such things from a factory, and you know you can pretty much buy and sell anything around the world at just a click of a button independently. So these are big transformations in the nature of commerce, trade, work, money. So these are huge transformations in the era of globalization, and especially with the advent of the internet. But as we can see, it's not all positives here, right? As we've seen in the 2008 economic crisis, sometimes called the 2007-2008 economic crisis, this interconnectedness has also led to a variety of consequences. The fact that financial systems of states are so intertwined made it impossible to contain the collapse of the US housing market within just the United States. Rather, globalization made the impacts of this crisis global in scope. So banks, for instance, overcommitted themselves to global finance. Banks are invested around the world. So when the crisis of what were called junk mortgages or subprime mortgages hit the United States, these were mortgages that were given to people who could not afford a home. When it increased, these people could borrow. When the value of the home keeps on increasing, people could keep on borrowing against their home. But when this slowed down, they could no longer borrow or pay for their mortgages, and this led to global. Housing was always considered a safe investment because housing prices were always seen as something that would never go down. It would always appreciate. But as what happened with the 2008 economic crisis, this is not what happened, right? Countries, outside the United States, a famous example would be Iceland, almost went bankrupt because they were overinvested in the US housing market. So when this market slowed, the banks didn't have enough money in the system. And so when people wanted their money back, the banks just did not have it, right? Because banks, you don't put in $10 to the bank to get the same $10 that you put in back if you want to withdraw it, right? Banks keep some reserve money stashed, but most of it goes to investments, et cetera, right? So we see places like Greece, Cyprus, Portugal, where there are major crises as a result of overcommitment in international investments, specifically in things like the US markets, right? So the housing market was seen as something that would increasingly rise. However, when the systemic risk of the system was finally exposed, it was already too late for many of these nation states that were already so overcommitted within the US housing market. So at this period of time, there was a lot of optimism about globalization, the globalization of markets, up until the 2008 crisis, when it kind of exposed these instabilities or weak points within a globalized political economy. So now there's more recognition of the danger of a global interconnected financial system, right? So the 2008 is an excellent case study for that. Cultural globalization. So with the ease of movement of goods, persons, services around the world, we begin to see the same things everywhere, right? It's called the McDonaldization of the world. And this refers to the kind of rise of global marketing campaigns. So what we can see here is we can go to a mall. For a good example is we can go to a mall in Toronto or Dubai or Hong Kong or Johannesburg or Mexico City or Buenos Aires, and you'll often find the same things, right? You'll find a Levi's, you'll probably find a Zara, you'll find a KFC, you'll find a Nike store. So you start to see the same things globally, right? And we see a homogenization around the world where there's increasing uniformity due to what's available through multinational corporations that operate globally. But what we see is actually less of a state-specific culture, right? Because very few things are available uniquely to each nation state. if you want if you live in Taiwan and you want maple syrup made in Quebec, you can get that, right? So you don't have to go on a vacation to travel to Quebec to get maple syrup. You can get it at the click of a button, very very far away, right? Um, so this was not always the case, though. A good example is prior to 1989 in the Soviet Union, which was closed to many of these goods in the liberal West. Global brands had to be smuggled and very difficult to obtain. But as we see the liberalization of markets and the expansion of global markets, we see this is no longer the case. Um, we see what's called often Americanization happening through this process as well, where because the US is the global hegemon, um, English and American movies like Hollywood, motion pictures, etc., American literature and culture more generally becomes more frequently seen around the world. Um, this is sometimes by those more critical of the United States and the West as cultural imperialism, because it's not always a two-way street, right? So we can see it's if an American business, for example, does business in Ghana, uh, there's not necessarily going to be equal Ghanaian influence on the United States, whereas the scale of American business makes their cultural tastes and norms prevalent outside of their borders much more frequently. So you might see a Levi's store, or you might see more American goods or American cultural tastes in foreign countries outside the United States, but you don't always see the exchange go both ways, right? So we can see that these are also representations of power, and the fact that many of these multinational corporations are located or headquartered within the West, right, or within the United States or within more powerful nation states. So we can see that this is also a form of economic hard power as well. But that being said, there's many cases where Americanization is not the only global political cultural influence. We can see that Bollywood from India, K-pop from South Korea are becoming immensely popular outside their countries of origin, and embraced by other states through globalization as well. So it's not all it's not all cultural imperialism or the power of the or Americanization. We do see some uh, you know cultural phenomenon that are also becoming popular through kind of these forms of soft power through states such as Korea and the rise of things like K-pop, right? Um, YouTube and social media makes art and media uh, increasingly accessible to the global community, right? But a key question is, how can a nation state and national cultures remain unique in an increasingly globalized world, especially one that continues to accelerate its interconnectedness and where states are increasingly unable to create barriers to these forms of cultural exchange, um, but while also wanting to make your economy attractive to the global market, right? So there's kind of a double incentive here for states. States, of course, want to uh, retain some of their independence, and the uniqueness of their state and society. But at the same time, they want to make themselves attractive to a global political economy and a world market, right? So another big question is, how do you protect language if there's such influence of English around the world? English being primarily the language of global business. Um, how do you protect languages in a world environment where certain languages are flow alongside the globalization of economies and culture, right? So this is a very important question too, is retaining these culturally unique aspects of a particular state, including their language, in the rise of the phenomenon of globalization. Okay, so we'll start talking today a little bit about political globalization, but we're going to go into much greater detail after the test. So we can kind of define this political globalization as international cooperation. So sacrificing some parts of sovereignty in order to tackle global issues, right? The pandemic is a good example of an issue that no individual country would be able to solve independently, right? Other examples include climate change is often a popular example because, of course, the ramifications of climate change can't be contained to any individual state. It's a global phenomenon. Cyber threats and cybersecurity is something that's often transcends borders. Global terrorism is another issue that's often seen as transcending the borders of any individual nation state. That's why you see such cooperation between different states in order to protect against the threat of global terrorism. So we can see here that these issues are ones that require new structures beyond the individual state apparatus in order to tackle these issues, right? So they require global cooperation and international cooperation between different nation states and institution building. So if there's no political globalization, however, and if states were to forego political globalization, some of these global issues revolving around, economic or cultural globalization might evolve into conflict between states, right? Because states have different, if they are narrowly nationalist or they're kind of autarkic, they might their resolution to some of these issues might be conflict between other states, right? So we can see here how important it is that this global cooperation happens to avoid some of these, especially when the contradictions of globalization or the negatives of globalization, they can be remedied more effectively through global cooperation. So we'll talk more about these as well after test one, but the rise of international organizations such as the United Nations, Arctic Council, and WTO is also a major aspect of political globalization. The rise of regional institutions such as the European Union, the African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. These are regional political entities that are increasingly becoming important as well. And many other forms of globalization, these forms of cooperation through institutions limit the power of nation states and limit their ability to forge their own independent path and means that they have less control or ability to respond to their own citizens. So while these forms of global cooperation are increasingly necessary to tackle these global issues, many of these global institutions are still less accountable to the democratic aspirations of citizenry or the democratic wishes of their citizenry than the nation state itself, right? Because the citizens do not vote on every aspect of the every United Nations resolution, for example, or the ongoing the issues going on in the World Trade Organization. Individuals are still left with the nation state as their primary the primary means in which they can express themselves democratically. So increasingly these regional institutions mean that citizens have less control over their individual country because these countries are also constrained by these regional institutions. So we can see this is an interesting aspect of globalization. So the good, right? So globalization, with its consequences, there's good and bad, right? So globalization has meant that countries have been able to have more access to markets and cultures around the world. So it expands their cultural, economic, and political horizons, which we can view as a good thing. There's less chance for conflict as political cooperation is expanded, right? So there's a long trope that liberal internationalist states never go to war with one another due to the deep ties between these types of states, right? Because the ties make the economic, cultural, political ties make war so difficult for each of the parties that it's less likely that they'll, because of this interconnectedness, because of the ties that bind individual, especially liberal states to one another, it makes it more difficult for them to go to war, right? And so the era of globalization has often meant less conflict between individual nation states. This does not mean that there's not conflicts occurring within the nation state, which has been a major aspect of the era of globalization. But individual nation states, specifically liberal states, going to war with one another has been less frequent. There's still been states that, you know, the Iraq War is a good example of liberal states going to, or so-called liberal international states, such as the UK and the United States, going to war with undemocratic or authoritarian regimes such as Saddam Hussein's Iraq. We can discuss the justifications or whatever for that war separately, but at the same time, we can see here that you know, states still go to conflict with one another, but liberal states, you know, you don't see the conflict between liberal internationalist states, right? Okay. So we also see the bad parts of globalization, the movement of jobs around the world, the destruction of manufacturing sectors in wealthy countries because of the high labor costs. For example, the offshoring of the auto sector in the West, and specifically in the United States, has created numerous job losses and economic turmoil in areas that once had a strong manufacturing sector. You look at Michigan, in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States, and what the collapse of the automotive sector has meant for that region. So now the labor that's done, that was often done in these strong manufacturing sectors in places like the United States, is largely done in developing nations where labor costs, and because of the rise of multinational corporations, because the advantage is created by lower labor costs for their profits, they can move their operations to countries that have, you know, less powerful unions, where the workers demand less compensation, often due to desperation and lack of other opportunity. And this has meant that, you know, we have these contradictions here where we have nation states within developing nations that are increasingly facing economic consequences due to this globalization as well, right? And this contributes to things such as resentment, xenophobia, and a desire for certain states to become more nationalist or closed off from the world. A good example of this is the Trump administration and those who supported the Trump campaign and the Trump presidency, right? This push towards nationalism was often supported by sectors of areas of the United States that was very much drastically impacted negatively by the globalization by aspects of globalization, specifically the movement of the manufacturing sector to areas outside the United States. So we see a divide here being created between those who benefit from globalization, so for instance, multinational corporations, the tech sector, and those who lose from globalization. So this would be manufacturing, perhaps small business that can no longer compete with large multinational corporations. And so this has a detrimental effect. It weakens local cultures, markets, and governments in various ways as well. And we see the rise of anti-globalization movements, both on the left and the right, in response to this, right? The best examples are, if you want to look at the United States examples, you can see this happening from in the 2016, in the 2020 presidential campaign, where both Donald Trump and on the more far right, and Bernie Sanders, who's more farther left, or the progressive left, both have a critique of globalization, specifically, you know, things like multinational corporations and the offshoring of labor. So there's a few things I want you to think about for next week. Is globalization an overall good or an overall bad? Is it a positive or negative force in contemporary politics? How or can local culture be protected in an era of globalization? How are you individually impacted by globalization? Do you benefit from globalization in your day-to-day life? And how can we increase the number of winners in globalization? How do we increase the number of people who benefit from these from globalization, especially considering it's a phenomenon that we will see probably and likely in our lifetimes accelerating even further and further, right? So we have to, these are very, very important topics to think about, especially moving, if you want to do a job in global business. thinking about these subjects that will be very important to you. So this is where we'll probably leave it for today. I want to remind everyone again that next week is the test, and you will need to be in the classroom before 7:15 p.m. Barry time to participate. There's absolutely no exception for technical difficulties or otherwise, so you must participate at this time. If you foresee any technical difficulties, I recommend getting in very early at 6 p.m. so we can remedy it any way we can. We can talk to the program director. We can figure out some way to figure out this technical difficulty. But I strongly recommend you make sure that everything is up and running and that you can participate in the test between 6 and 8 p.m. on Monday during class time, Barry time. There will be no makeup test or ability to do the test in another time. This is the only time slot in which the test will be available. We have to treat it like an exam in any other university where you have to be there to write the exam in the classroom. We're kind of doing an imitation of a classroom online. So make sure that you're there. So unless you want to receive a 0 on the test, you must be there when the test is live at 6 p.m. You have 45 minutes to write the test, and it will no longer be live at 8 p.m. So no matter what, you have to be finished. If you anticipate an issue, finish before, finish at 7:58. Just make sure you don't leave it to the last second because it closes at 8 p.m. And there will be no exceptions. It will be on Blackboard under the assignments, and you must submit it before 8 p.m. Yeah, I have no control over. I have no control over the test after the time expires, and so you just keep that in mind. I also want to give everyone a reminder that for future assignments, the academic honesty statement, I gave an exception this time. I only took off 5% for those who failed to submit the academic honesty statement, but next time it will not accept any assignments that do not have the academic honesty statement, and it will be a fail on the assignment. So you must attach the academic honesty statement and hand in your assignments on time on Blackboard. So I was generous enough to give only 5% off this time, but next time it will be no exception. You must, just because navigating with this many students makes it very difficult when there's email chains regarding these assignments. So you must submit at that time or else I will just not mark the paper. So make sure that you have your academic honesty statement pasted to your assignments for all future assignments. It's absolutely mandatory. And yeah, that's all I have for you today. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you all after the test. Take care, everyone.